Ladies and gentlemen, let's start. So good to see you all. And we're here for the third presentation in our seminar series, Ethics of Care. And we welcome today Fabienne Brugère from the University of Paris, number 8. Yeah. So we'll first introduce Fabienne. Franz Vosman, my co-convener of this series, will do it. And after that, Fabienne will do a presentation, about 50 minutes. And after that, question and answer, suggestions, comments, and so forth. So, Franz, please.
I'm particularly happy to be here today because of Fabienne Brugère. I must tell you, I was so excited when I first discovered, 2009, the work of French colleagues working on the ethics of care. They did a wonderful job in those years, bringing people together, writing on the ethics of care. And my excitement was about Fabienne's work. What is very special to my mind in her work, that she is a very good scholar, but an intellectual as well, which is quite a rare, at least in Holland, to find this combination. People can be very good scholars, but not all scholars are very good in intellectual work. And to be more precise, I think Fabienne's research is driven by concerns on societal problems, and she tries to contribute in her thinking to get clear concepts that might really be helpful in finding solutions to these societal problems. So she's thinking about issues like who are actually vulnerable people in our society, not just as a concept, vulnerability and autonomy, but who are the people who are actually vulnerable, and what does that mean for policy making. There are many more of these issues that I think are typical for the French way to do the ethics of care. It's highly political, which is very worthwhile, I think. But as I said, also a very good scholar, and I think she will present some of her scholarly research on Scottish Enlightenment, on the value of emotions, and as it is seen in the ethics of care nowadays in a very critical way. Emotions, yes. The intelligence of emotions, yes, but just something more about that to say, of course. Emotions can mislead us. So she did a very good job on that as well. Her thèse d'état was on the subject. So here's a professor from France bringing you back good British thought on the emotions.
Thank you very much, Franz, for this presentation. Thank you very much, Jacobus, for this invitation. Yes, it will be better. So, I apologize for my French accent, but I'm going to speak in English. So, it's about emotions as constituents for an ethics of care. The project of an ethic of care has to do with emotional factors. It engages moral relations which stress the possibility of moral sentiments more than an abstract reason. More precisely, some kinds of emotions are valued in contrast with the dominant rationalist approaches connected to Kantian philosophy. From a care point of view, moral inquiries rooted on reason and rationalistic deductions are considered as deficient and unjustly dominant. Rationalistic moral theories reject egoistic feelings, of course, and private interests. That means favoritism and prevents universality. But what sorts of emotions are appreciated in an ethics of care? Of course, there are emotions with relational capabilities and implicated in interpersonal and institutional contexts, as relations between a parent and child, a patient and a nurse, or a homeless and a social worker. For an ethics of care, it is important to develop relations of caring that respond to the perception of need and express a person's concern. These contextual moral theories question the philosophical acceptance of universal morality. For example, it is easy to recognize an obligation for all parents to care for their children. But it does not mean that in all actual fact relations between parents and children are satisfactory and that all children live in a familial context favorable to their personal development. Obligations have to be combined with relations of caring, with attitudes meeting dependent or vulnerable human beings. In other words, borrowed from Carol Gilligan, two moral perspectives have to be recognized. The justice perspective, which is dominant, and a care perspective, forgotten by the intellectual tradition and able to constitute an alternative perspective. As Carol Gilligan writes, I quote, "It calls attention to the fact that all human relationships, public and private, can be characterized both in terms of equality and in terms of attachment." End of quotation. I should like to stress these two kinds of morals in terms of equality on one part and in terms of attachment in another part. This distinction between equality and attachment is a distinction between justice and care, between reason and emotions. Caring relationships, from Gilligan's point of view, are constituted in terms of attachment. It implies that the sort of emotional relation constituted between a parent and a child is a model of care. Attachments provide connections to others and are usually focused towards the parent figure who brings physical and emotional security. For example, the good enough mother from Winnicott means a physical and emotional attachment, the early attachment to mother, because before the attachment to transitional object. It is a love between two imperfect people, the mother being capable of an adaptation to the baby. The good enough mother provides physical care and meets her baby's need for emotional love. The example of the good enough mother gives substance to a dependency that concerns our needs. A baby is not self-sufficient. He or she is closely connected or linked to those who are useful for sustaining his or her life. He or she is vulnerable to abandonment. I should like to argue today that the question of vulnerability is very important for an ethics of care, conscious of the importance of emotions or feelings. Child's tie to his or her caregivers implies the conception of an ego-relatedness where vulnerability and the sphere of emotions are essential. On the one hand, vulnerability presupposes a conception of human beings that restores feeling or emotional relation as a motive for action that impregnates ethics. But on the other hand, the insistence on attachment is not insignificant and has to be discussed. Assembling love, emotion, and the relationship between a mother and her baby often means an association between moral theory and woman, moral theory and family, care and gender. For Gilligan, the theme of care has to do with the different voice of women that represents an individuation with a basis for empathy, a capacity to experience another needs or feeling, and to take vulnerability into account. Differently, signs of detachment and lacks of concern are qualified by Gilligan as more male than female. It is important to discuss this gender orientation and the connection between women and emotion. And I will emphasize the theme of desentimentalized emotion and the theme of a good distance in caring relationships, a possibility for considering the model of motherhood in a critical approach. So I'm going to try to establish that proposition in 3 parts. A first part about the question of an anthropology of vulnerability and the connection between this anthropology of vulnerability and the sphere of emotions. In a second part, I will talk about the connection between emotions and the question of gender and the place of women in caring relations. And in a third part, I will discuss the possibility to establish a kind of distance in the sphere of emotion, and I will try to talk about social care and the way a social care can introduce the possibility of desentimentalized emotions. So, the first part is an anthropology of vulnerability and the sphere of emotions. The views of Scottish Enlightenment thinkers as Hutcheson, Hume, and Smith imply an account on moral life, problematizing moral sentiments with the role of the concepts of moral sense and of sympathy. They call into question the abstract rules of our dominant theories, inhabited by the idea that moral maturity is rational, expressing will or autonomy of human beings. But people have real emotional needs to be attached to something, to be attached to someone, and it means a moral perspective too. Morality is essential for creating interaction between people, interdependence in conformity with a model of decent society different from the liberal one and rooted in individual autonomy and the figure of a subject of rights. Annette Bayer writes about Gilligan's in a different voice, and she explains there are two visions of morality that engage two visions of emotions. I quote, "The emphasis in Kantian theories on rational control of emotions rather than on cultivating desirable forms of emotion is challenged by Gilligan along with the challenge to the assumption of the centrality of autonomy or relations between equals and of freely chosen relation." It's in Justice and Care, the paper from Annette Bayer. But what does an emphasis on cultivating desirable forms of emotion mean? Annette Bayer explains it with the role of parents. Parents need to love their children, not just to control their irritation or their caprice. The unequal infant does not choose its place in a family or in a nation. To assume parental responsibilities implies anything else than power and control. It is important to care for children with a sort of attention and protection that does not exclude the importance of emotions. This rethinking of ethical and social bonds by Annette Bayer combines the emotional sphere with the preservation of life and the necessity to guarantee needs to everybody, because all humans are vulnerable, more or less, of course. I should like to insist on this concept of vulnerability that invites a subversion of modern individualism and a new place for the sphere of emotions. One cannot reflect on an ethics of care without subscribing to an anthropology of vulnerability, the vulnerability of both the cared for and the carers, from the fact of their lack of place in society. Of course, vulnerability presupposes a conception of the human which rehabilitates feeling or emotion as a motive for action. More precisely, it gives priority to delicate relationships, part of which may be beyond our control. Vulnerability prompts thought on dependence and what they may reveal. It is a moment when we are formed by relations with others which escape our consciousness. These relations of dependency, which reveal, for example, the vulnerability of a newborn, constitute the subject in an opaque way. These relations of dependency indicate a primary opacity of the self. And there is a history of this primary opacity of the self and of the vulnerability it implies. This history of vulnerability could begin with Rousseau in Émile. Rousseau distinguishes two kinds of dependency towards other human beings and toward objects. He explains the first is social, the second natural. The dependency towards objects is not very important because it does not injure freedom. And it's very different from the dependency towards human beings. If a natural human being does not refer to anything else except his own needs, a social human being is very dependent. The contract in the discourse on inequality must be understood as a voluntary association, which means a hidden servitude. His dependency for Rousseau, only this kind of servitude, perhaps not. If we try to read Émile, especially book 4, there is another dependency which is more complicated and can be apprehended through the opacity of the self-information. This dependency reveals a kind of dignity which cannot be assimilated to servitude. The example of the child gives substance in Émile to a dependency which concerns our needs. A child is not self-sufficient. He or she is closely connected to those who are useful for the sustaining of his or her life. As a child, he or she does not know he or her social rank or place. The opacity of the self resides in an incapacity to occupy a place because the child is too weak. The opacity is a mark of a primary vulnerability. Rousseau writes about Émile as a child. Firstly, a child must feel his or her weakness, but must not suffer from it. Secondly, he or she is only subordinated to others as a result of his needs and because they see more than he does what is useful for him. Thirdly, he must depend on others, but he must not obey. And it's a very important point in Émile, this third point. So, the question of needs symbolize the dependency of children and not at all their submission, but their interdependence. This means that dependency is structured through an aim. This aim is the development of the child. This is how we can introduce an ethics of care. Caring, taking care of a child, has a limit, what is good for the child. But dependency is complex and linked to a context in an interdependent social world. We can characterize the world of care with this interdependence. Yet, what does interdependence mean? It means an irregular or unstable world which has to do with emotions and with the definition of love. For Rousseau, this is the kind of game we can elaborate between self-love, amour-propre, and love of others. Caring can be considered in that way as love's labor, to borrow the title of a book by Eva Feder-Kitté. Love's labor. Love, and more generally the sphere of emotions, have to be associated with an ethic of care. Love, caring, and the construction of emotions produce relations which have to do with the inequality of vulnerability. This inequality means irregularity, instability as well. What explains all these figures of a certainty is that the sphere of emotions take place in a context or in a situation. Emotions have to do with accidents, and on that point, we could quote Adam Smith and the theory of moral sentiments about the irregularity of the sphere of emotions. The irregularity of emotions or sentiments is not a danger for human beings. It constitutes a part of the happiness of the species. More precisely, it is useful to engage individuals in all kinds of action. An action means changes in the external circumstances. If the emotional sphere is irregular, it implies that this sphere is plastic, that is to say, capable of changes to attain an aim. this point can be read as an attempt to transgress the philosophical boundary between reason and emotions. For Annette Bayer, it is the importance to stress the importance of the sphere of emotion can be understood as an attack on the whole patriarchal theological tradition and on its claims about the relative authority of various human voices. There is the same kind of enterprise with the ethics of care in order to move the philosophical boundary between reason and emotion, to break the association between reason and a masculine voice, between sentiments and a feminine voice. The ethical project consists in a critical analysis of Kantian moral philosophies. Such philosophies forget that it is impossible to reduce sentiments or emotions to irrationality. They are susceptible of a complex elaboration which take place in a context, in an understanding of changes in external circumstances. We could draw a comparison in the same way as the moral sentiments arguments of the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers represent the losing side in moral thinking in the 18th century. Caring represents a minority morality too. We can add that caring has no value in our society structured by capitalism and liberalism. John Tronto analyzes what she calls marginalizing care. The point of view about caring does not principally engage the conception of an emotional sphere which has been reduced to a construct to separate men and women, public space and privacy. The analysis is about care as a work. Care work is devalued, but care is also devalued through a connection with privacy, with emotion, and with the needy. And so, care is invisible. And in the second part, I should like to explain this invisibility with the question of gender inequalities in care. Of course, the invisibility of care has to do with gender differences and with the role of emotions. On the one hand, many of the thinkers who have written about care describe it only as an attitude or disposition. For example, Nell Nodings formulates an ethics of caring which combines two feelings or emotions, the sentiment of natural caring and the remembrance of the first in response. But the universality she invokes is puzzling. I quote, "The caring attitude that lies at the heart of all ethical behavior is universal as a mother." End of quotation. For Nodings, there is no criticism of naturalism. She could not agree with the idea that motherhood is a socially constructed institution regularly used to legitimize women's oppression. On the other hand, in addition to care being associated with the emotional as opposed to the rational, care is also devalued in its meaning through its related association with the private sphere. Care is conceived of in our culture as ideally a private concern which has to do with women as mothers and female sentiments. Women are expected to care for those who live under their roof. It is because care has been elaborated in a private sphere with the force of feelings that it cannot be recognized. And that's really the main reason for the invisibility of care. How can an area of care be recognized when it comprises a variety of unrecognized activities? Carol Gilligan's book, In a Different Voice, is instructive because it raises the issue of care and women's silenced voices. According to Gilligan, moral questioning is rooted in the observation of gender inequality. Women do not approach moral problems the same way men do, and their voices are made vulnerable in the name of defending a rational morality that considers itself free from divisions, when in fact it excludes from the domain of moral action everything resembling empathy with the other or responsibility with respect to the vulnerability or needs of others. Women's voices are not different from men's, but masculine domination has made them inaudible by creating a correlation between moral feelings, the private or family arena, and a supposed feminine nature, particularly in the 18th century, when the conception of the public sphere was tied to contracts and excluded any dependent persons, primarily women, but also slaves, domestic servants, and poor laborers. So Gilligan calls for once again valuing women's voices to establish equality between two moralities. Of course, such an ethic of responsibility or care must vindicate the forgotten experiences of women, which have been poorly evaluated in masculine moral psychologies, such as those of Kohlberg, cited by Gilligan. But, above all, it must transform gender relationships and eliminate the inequalities that lead to socially positioning men and women to the detriment of the activities involving concern for others that women perform. In short, a feminist ethics is needed to democratize society and promote equality between voices, between reason and feelings, between public and private, moral and political. Such an ethics must make women, it's very important, aware of the need to live behind the imposed and conventional goodness of care as a self-sacrifice in favor of a relational morality that combines concern for the self and concern for others, while being aware, of course, of situations and chains of vulnerability. And it's very important point that implies restoring equality in the area of care, and it means considering vulnerability within the framework of an ethic. And it means to understand the project of an ethics of care as the possibility of the expression of a relational maturity, of a sense of collective responsibility too. And it means too an ethic that, having deconstructed gender inequalities, could be applied to humankind and enable us to relate to others in a way that reflects a concrete rather than a generalized other. And this relational maturity is a way for women to experiment a new sort of caring attitude. It means that women have to abandon a typical feminine attitude, the self-sacrifice, which means a concern for others and no concern for the self. And my third part is about gender inequality and how to go from gender inequalities to the conception of a social care work. And I hope I'm going to have time for this point. Let us consider that caring for the vulnerable constitutes an interpersonal accompaniment and should be developed in social policies concerning non-autonomous individuals. However, it cannot be developed without respecting some form of the capacity to act, be, or say. Treating vulnerability does not mean losing sight of the care recipient's ability to be productive. Assistance must not be confused with charity. Moreover, in the area of gender inequality, one could say that the naturalization movement, which linked the future of women to emotions and solicitude within the family sphere. I wrote a book entitled Le sexe de la sollicitude on that point, was replaced with the need for a certain number of women to consider care as work and take very often poorly paid, invisible jobs that turn their dependence into exploitation in precarious jobs. Stressing the struggle against inequalities, and not only gender inequalities, means to argue that caring relations are not only interpersonal relations. Vulnerability and feelings or emotions are not merely given properties of individuals. More precisely, vulnerability, needs, as well as emotions cannot be condemned to silence. They conserve concrete others, as Sela Ben-Habib writes in a paper about Gilligan, but concrete others or a more integrated vision of ourselves do not exclude the conception of a welfare state and both social and political relationships. If relationships have an affective or emotional constitution, it does not mean that caring relations are only interpersonal. For a French philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, in a book entitled Oneself as Another, Soi-même comme un autre. Donc, for Paul Ricoeur, to consider the other as one considers oneself involves a notion of living well which cannot limit itself to interpersonal relationships, but extends to institutions and to the need for them to be just. Ethics, for Ricoeur, is always both social and political. Furthermore, when it occupies itself with the care of others and human vulnerability, it cannot but extend itself into the establishment of, as just as possible, a historical community. Institutions must play their part in producing a care society in which vulnerability may be shared and responsibility collectively assumed in the face of different forms of dependence. In fact, even if ethics of care proclaim that we are all more or less vulnerable, it still stands that care supposes concrete asymmetrical relations, which is a problem for a philosophy of equality. Paul Ricoeur states the need for institutions in this framework of relations and practices. Institutions allow us to break free from dyadic relations that are initially asymmetrical. They must make, I quote, the search for equality through inequality inevitable, through recognition of the value of the other. Now, this recognition cannot be carried by a relation which is not guaranteed by the presence of institutions. Relating to another supposes being able to view them as another self, which implies a plurality of human relations and a common world that cannot be reduced to dialogic relations. Institutions define a common power to the anonymous that are also the vulnerable. From this point of view, it's important to consider, of course, the definition of institutions, and Ricoeur has a very broad definition of the institution, because it is the structure of living together of a historical community, people, nature, region, a structure that cannot be reduced to interpersonal relations. And with this definition of institution, I should like to introduce the possibility of a social care. And I should like to explain that with Ricoeur's definition of institution, it would be important to talk about care with, of course, empathy and a concern for others, but to talk about care with, in a professional or institutional way. The point is necessary a reconsideration of the sphere of emotions and expresses the possibility to render them more professional. It means a sort of desentimentalized attitude. The emotional sphere, in that case, has to be combined with responsibility or a strong communication skills, for example. The caring attitude is not only constituted by solicitude, compassion, or altruism. To conclude, I will consider what Dublin Institute of Technology, especially the Department of Social Sciences and Law, explains about social care work, constituting a very clever difference between social workers and social care workers. And it's really a difference which would be impossible to do in French, in the French context. But this perspective, this point of view is very interesting because they try to answer to the following problem: what is social care? And they write, and they explain, I quote, social care workers plan and provide professional, individual, or group care to clients with personal and social needs. Client groups are varied and include children and adolescents in residential care, young people in detention schools, people with intellectual or physical disabilities, people who are homeless, people with drug dependency, families in the community, and or older people. And they explain social care workers strive to support, protect, guide, and advocate on behalf of clients. Social care work is based on interpersonal relationships which require empathy, but which require too some strong communication skills, self-awareness, and an ability to use critical reflection. And I should like to add that it means that social care workers meet people's needs in an environment or context, and they use their emotion, empathy, for example, in a professional way. associated with other qualities as critical reflection, for example. In that way, there is a sort of neutralization from empathy, a sort of professionalization of emotions that is a distance from the emotional sphere and all we could understand in this emotional sphere: altruism, compassion in difficult circumstances, and so on. And, for example, maturity, trustworthiness, and reliability are important, and they mean a sort of calm professionals. So emotions in that way, and when we try to combine care and the question of a social work, emotions are constituent for an ethics of care, but they have to be combined and associated with other qualities. This association of emotions with other qualities is very important because a social care worker works in a direct person-to-person capacity, and he has to protect the other and himself against the abuses of the emotional sphere, which would become a sentimental sphere. And when, as usual, when we talk about a sentimental sphere, we talk about this question of an ideality of femininity and the question of the nature of sentiments and so on. And to conclude, I think it's very important to stress on the social care workers' role, which is not really the social workers' role. There are really a difference between a social care worker and a social worker, because the social worker is going, for example, to arrange the residential child placement, is going to place a child, for example, but the social care practitioner is more in a direct person-to-person capacity, but it does not mean that there are no institutions, and it must guarantee the presence of institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabienne. So there's no ample time for questions and or comments. So please, let's hear this interesting thing of a desentimentalized emotions. Good. So please, your name and your affiliation, please.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Megan O'Donnell. I'm an MPhil student in Modern Middle Eastern Studies. And I did my fieldwork over the summer in domestic violence shelters in Morocco for women, Centre d'Hébergement there. And what you were saying at the end about the need for empathy in a professional way really resonated with what I was seeing in these contexts. But within the context I was observing, I think one of the impediments to that was the fact that shelter practitioners felt like they were sacrificing a lot, that they oppose the state, that they're not receiving institutional support, that these organizations are entirely theirs, and they're sort of fighting on their own for these women and for their own lives. So I'm wondering if you've seen that in other contexts, some of the inabilities or the obstacles to professionalize when it's so personal?
On that point, it's very important to have the possibility to guarantee a conception of the state and of institution, and a kind of conception that we could understand as a kind of sustainable institution. But it's really complicated to get this kind of state in Europe, but in Morocco too, in a lot of countries in the world. And the question is the question of the chance of vulnerability. And what you explain is that in that kind of work, we can experiment to have no sustain from the institution, and we are obliged to be in a kind of self-sacrifice, because the institution is not a satisfying institution. I wrote on that point, but in French, in a book entitled La politique de l'individu, and I try to explain that I tried to explain that it would be really important to get public policies that would be sustainable policies, but it means something which is very difficult. It means that a state is capable of a relation with each individual, and it's very important from a care society. That point, that means interpersonal relation, but with institution, and the importance of sustainable institution is really in the possibility to connect public policies with individuals, with caregivers, with care receptors, and so on. And for instance, in France, it's really complicated to get this kind of connection, and so very, very often social workers experiment the fact that they are alone. They have a welfare state, they are a kind of social state, but this state is not useful, in fact. So it's a very important problem, but I think that today, with the crisis in Europe, with the crisis of welfare state, and with neoliberalism too, it's really complicated to resolve that point.
Good. Any other comments, questions, ideas? So, David.
Thank you very much. My name is David Jones. I run a bioethics centre in Oxford. I may well have misunderstood, so forgive me, but I was concerned a little about your characterization of the dominant masculine rationalism in that you seemed, when it came to maternal instincts, to say these are partly socially constructed, but when it comes to this particular dominant male voice, then you didn't qualify. Perhaps you would, but you didn't qualify, because it seems to me there's a question. There's a question in terms of male psychology, and in terms of, I mean, there isn't a proper equivalent to sort of male feminism, but of what it is to reconstruct a view of self and other in regard to reason and emotion, which doesn't project emotion on women and therefore rationalism on men. You see what I mean? So this is also it's also a problem for men. This and as you said from Hume and others, is not true equally of all male thinkers by any means, and not true of all male institutions. So I mean, I speak also as someone who was part of a religious order, where therefore the men were carers because all roles were male roles, and also I speak as somebody who's now a carer, though a man. So I'm a little. I want to learn from, and I'm interested in, women's voice talking to women, as it were. But also there's a question about what's then the role for a reconstruction of forms of male psychology.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I didn't have time in that talk to explain more about women voices and men voices, and yes, I didn't qualify this question of men voices. That's true. I think there are two important ways of qualifying that question of men's voices. Of course, we could repeat what Gilligan's analysis and the division between care perspective, which is largely a woman perspective, and a justice perspective, which is largely a man's perspective. And the second perspective, we could add, it is a perspective with an abstract reason, with the importance of principles in morals, of laws, and so on. And we could stay and explain this division made by Gilligan, but it's important to take a precaution, because Gilligan explains women voices are generally women's voices, and men voices are generally men voices. It means that what she analyzes is a result from inquiries and from discussions with men and women about morals. But the most important is not women's voices or men's voices, but is the connection we could try to build between a care perspective and a justice perspective, between a care perspective which has been dominated and a justice perspective. To tell more about men's voices and men's perspectives, yes, it would be important to analyze the place of men, and to take in account, of course, the fact that that the place for women is not very easy, but the place for men can be uneasy too. I think my point of view is really firstly it is really to stress this different voice, and if I choose to describe this different voice more than the dominant voice, it's really in the perspective that it has been forgotten. And so we have to talk about that voice because that voice is in a large way invisible, and it's important it's important to give that voice a sort of visibility. So in that way, there is a difference between women voices and men voices, but women voices are not only voices from women. John Tronto explains in Moral Boundary that this voice can be this care perspective can be I don't know what word to choose. This care perspective is a perspective for migrants or poor laborers and so on, for instance. What is important in your question is that, yes, it would be important today in the research field of care to stress now the importance of men's voices and to try to explain if there is, I have this question, perhaps there are a plurality of men's voices, and perhaps it would be important to stress that point. Yes, and really, now we are at a moment, at a theoretical moment, where ethics of care have rendered visible what was invisible. But yes, it would be important now to stress on the other part of the relationship, because it is a relationship, and that's what you mentioned, in fact. If we talk about relationships, we must describe the two parts of the relationship. Yes.
Good. Anything more?
Thank you very much for that. I'm old and I'm deaf, and I don't speak French, but it came over very well, and I understood most of it. Thank you. What I wanted what intrigued me was your idea of the good enough mother. And I was just wondering whether it was very easy to be a good enough mother when you had 6 children and you had them young, and now you have 1 or 2, and you often have them when you're much older, and it makes it more difficult. And in those days, you could have good enough professionals, and nurses were respected, and doctors were respected, and even some politicians. But now, because of the scrutiny that we're all under, that is very difficult to achieve, in my view. And I see us walking along the plank, as it were, and finding it very difficult to find a solution to that, because people are going to burn out more easily, whether they're mothers or anything else. And I wondered if you had any comments. From my own background, I'm not from Oxford. I'm from London and have looked after people who are dying for the last 20 years. So that's my background.
Yes. That's a very important point, and we know that today in big cities like London, New York, or Paris, the question of burnout is a reality, and this question of burnout makes, of course, that the idea of a good enough mother or a good enough care social worker is not so easy. It's not so easy, but it would imply, but perhaps is it easier for French people who are always imagining a kind of new political solution? It would. I explained it in a book I wrote on ethics of care in French, translated in Japanese, and I explained that point and the fact that today, when we try to reflect about ethics of care, we have to reflect about neoliberalism and the organization of our social, of our relations in the social work and the place of work and the place of jobs and so on. And of course, it's impossible to just to say, it's really difficult just to say we can imagine today a good enough care relation in a professional context. It's really difficult. And as a philosopher, but I am a philosopher, I'm not a politician. As a philosopher, I think it's very important in response, to give an answer to this problem, to analyze the question and the place of the work in our society. How can we imagine a kind of society where people could work less and could get time for caring, for instance, but not only for caring? And so, for my part, but it's very important to build a connection between an ethics of care and a critical approach of all political systems in the world today, and to have the possibility to explain something about neoliberalism and the possibility to change something. But it's easy for philosophers. It's not so easy for politicians, for people who are really in a kind of experience with burnout and so on. I imagine we could just try to, perhaps we could try to really take in consideration the possibility of adopting a kind of ethics. When we work, perhaps it is important to have in mind that we have to organize a kind of connection between the self and others, and it's always something which must be a kind of harmony. But it's really difficult today, and it's really difficult today in very big cities, because I live between Bordeaux and Paris, and it's very different. The question of work between Bordeaux and Paris is very different. There are really today a lot of burnout in Paris, and when you are in the subway, for instance, in Paris, it's incredible. All people, when they talk together, talk about work and the difficulty of working relations and so on. And yes, it's really an important point. I think it would be important to write something about the connection of an ethics of care in very big cities, where and to take in consideration the question of the burnout, of course, yes.
Thank you all very much for being here, and Fabienne, thank you very much, and please join me to thank her again. So, next week we'll have another French view on the ethics of care, Sandra Lugière from University of Paris 1, and she will share with us an aesthetics of the ordinary in an ethics of care. So we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much.